have captured the light. The first ray of the sun filtering through the room, the shimmering of the sea to the golden sundown, the dancing candles, the dimming sky over the city, the stillness and the sweeping clouds. I have recorded the moments, the gentle wind carrying us, bringing splashes and laughter, the warm hand in mine, the music and the rhythm of the rain, the resonance of the space. I've collected them all, everything in its place. A home to delight in and share, today and for generations. For every memory, a special place.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Saldran, your host and moderator of this series of Bespoke lifestyle sessions. Now, as someone who's been covering the international and local luxury sector for over 15 years for the TV show Executive Class, I am really excited to kick off the first of a series of lifestyle sessions presented by Ayala Land Premier in partnership with Ayala Malls. Now, our first session, as you can see, is called Perpetual Classics. And as the title suggests, we're here to discuss something truly timeless and special, something with value that endures over time, something to pass on to future generations, a pursuit that requires taste, knowledge, and a level of connoisseurship in an industry where reputation is paramount. Okay, you might be thinking I'm referring to Ayala Land Premier's exclusive properties, and indeed there are parallels between the two, but actually we're here to discuss something else. Timepieces and watchmaking technology and craftsmanship, from basics like the anatomy of a watch to more specific topics like the history of legendary watch brands, their iconic models, and of course, practical buying and collecting tips, and how to have fun in the process. That's important. So regardless of whether you're just starting your watch journey or if you're a more advanced enthusiast, or maybe just looking to buy a gift for yourself or your loved one, trust me, you're going to find this session interesting, especially since we've invited one of the country's foremost experts to share his knowledge with us this afternoon. But before I introduce our speaker, let me just remind everyone that you can join the discussion by typing your questions or your comments via the Q&A tab that you'll find below on your screens, okay? We'd love to hear from you. Now, the session will be broken up in two parts. The first half will cover the basics of watchmaking, like key parts of a watch and common, though often misunderstood watch terms. Now, after that, we'll open the floor to your questions. Then we'll have a second session, which will cover specific watch brands and some of the more interesting models released in 2021. So save your questions about specific brands and models for that open forum later. All right, let's get started by introducing our speaker. And wow, we have such a great speaker this afternoon. Carl Cunanan is the editor-in-chief of Caliber, a magazine that specializes in news, reviews, and information about timepieces. Carl was a watch enthusiast for decades, he still is, by the way, with close connections and friendships within the local and the international watch industry. His magazine Caliber is regarded by enthusiasts as a consumer title, but within the industry, it's considered a trade title that was key to the development of the Philippines into a high-growth market, the one that it's become. Now, Mr. Cunanan has been published around the region and is an Academy member of the Grand Prix d'Horlogerie de Genève, which every year awards the best of the watchmaking world in Geneva, Switzerland. Okay, he's been a resource speaker for different organizations, clubs, and brands on the topic of watches. And on a personal note, I've known Carl for many years as well, having had the opportunity to cover many international and local watch events with him. And let me just tell everyone here, you're very lucky to have Carl with you because he's one of the most respected sources of watch information. So ladies and gentlemen, let's all welcome Carl Cunanan. Carl, good to have you.
Hello, David. How are you?
I'm fine. Now, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, as you know. But it's great to know, Carl, that the watch world just keeps on ticking, and so are you. So have you.
Well, glad for both of us. Glad for all of us. We'll get through this.
Okay, Carl, let's not waste any time. So you have 30 minutes for the first session. This is going to be really interesting. Basics, but coming from you, nothing is really basic. So let's go ahead and let's have the questions right after. Ladies and gentlemen, Carl Cunanan.
Okay, hello everyone. First of all, I am going to talk to you about what is in a watch and everything like that. This is the basics we're going to go through. We're going to start with Watches 101. What is inside a watch? Okay, let's see how this goes. What is inside a watch? First of all, let's talk about what's inside, which is the mechanical movement. In general, we will think of it as a mechanical movement. There are other kinds of movements. There is a mechanical movement, and there's a quartz movement, and there's something called a hybrid movement, which we'll get into in a little bit. The mechanical ones are basically the type of thing that was produced in Switzerland or England or Japan 100 years ago, all metallic, all metal, and so on. The quartz came about in the mid to late 20th century using modern technology, which you can see the little wiring and so on, and the battery. Quartz is, just so you know, quartz is a definition of the mechanism for regulation. It is not a definition of the source of power. So it does not mean quartz is a battery. For example, with the hybrids from Grand Seiko, they are powered by mechanical movements, as you can see by the rotor in the center photo, but it actually gets coursed through a transistor. That's what gives it the accuracy. Let's be very, very clear. The mechanical movements are more collectible, but the quartz movements are far more accurate. So those are your choices. One of the reasons why quartz is still popular, by the way, is in particular for women's watches. You can have these small women's watches, and the honest complaint was we keep breaking our nails when we try to adjust the watch. So it is an answer to that. And Patek Philippe, as an example, with their 24s and so on, they're very clearly happy with it. Okay, the case is what surrounds the watch. In general, we were looking at metals, which would be steel or precious metal like gold, silver now. Tudor has a great silver watch, which we haven't seen in a long, long time. It's awesome. We have other watches that are made of things like resins, plastics, and so on. Just because it is a plastic or resin watch does not necessarily mean it's inexpensive. You can have inexpensive ones, such as Swatch, and you can have very, very expensive ones that are not metal or in any way, such as the Hublots. They can be actually sapphire crystal, which brings us to another thing. What do you call what's in front of the watch? We call it glass. In reality, it's not glass. It is either, generally for the watches that you guys are looking at, they're going to be sapphire crystal. Sapphire crystal is not glass. It is grown in a lab. It is created. Okay. People like Rolex make their own, and they kind of glue that little, what they call the unicorn on top of it. People like Frank Muller and so on make their own. They shape it their own way because they have very specific shapes. If you look at the Frank Muller Curbex shapes, no one else in the world is going to make that stuff. Okay. That is not the only material for the glass face of a watch, the glass cover. You also have something far more historic, which is acrylic or a resin. Now, the strength of sapphire crystal is that it is very, very scratch resistant. It is not as impact resistant as other materials like acrylic. So for things like a very, very tough tool watch, like a dive watch you will use when you are diving under a wreck or under a oil platform, you would rather have the acrylic. Although honestly, I don't see people really breaking sapphire crystal watches now anymore. Anyway, the other thing that acrylics are good for is that they are part of a heritage. So, for example, in that Speedmaster right there, or in some Panerais, people would rather have the acrylic because it will develop a haze. It has a bit of a warmth to it, whereas sapphire crystal tends to be surgically perfect. It's really a choice. Some watches, let's say some of the collectible watches from Panerai, will give you a choice or give you both acrylic and sapphire crystal, and then you just change it as you wish. So it really comes down to what you want. What is around that sapphire crystal is the bezel. The bezel is, it's basically what's just around the glass. It can be fixed as it is in the left on the Grand Seiko. It can be moving as it is on the right in the Sport Seiko. In general, it will be moving for things like dive watches, pilot's watches, maybe. One interesting thing is that, for example, Cartier never made a moving crystal dive watch for the longest time, a moving bezel dive watch for the longest time. When they decided to make a dive watch, they spent an entire day just clicking and listening to the sound and feeling it because it had to have the perfect Cartier sound and feel. So they went through everybody else's watches before they finally made their own decision. So it's that key. Bracelets and straps. This is what keeps the watch on your wrist. And this is actually far more important than most people realize, especially now since we've all gained or lost weight during the pandemic. The simplest one is the bracelet. Okay. It's just all metal. It's the simplest to use. It's the easiest. The negatives are it can be a bit thicker. It can be a bit harder to adjust if you're doing the adjustments yourself, as opposed to a strap, which you can kind of adjust all on your own. One point to note, if you do get a watch with a bracelet, and okay, if you have a choice of a watch and it comes with bracelet or a strap, we suggest you buy the bracelet because it's always more expensive to buy the bracelet if you decide later on you'd rather have it, which I have done and is not a good idea. The other thing is on the right, you have all these little links and they will take those links off when they fit the watch on you. And nowadays, if you have any kind of a collectible watch, they will size it for you because they don't want you walking out of that shop without an unadjusted watch. Mainly because they want it to fit right, but also because nowadays people are flipping watches like crazy. They don't want them to do that. Keep in mind that if you do have links taken out, make sure the links are still there. This will not be a problem in a place like Lucerne or Rolex or Patek or anything like that. But if you're buying from a secondary dealer or someone else, they may well give it to you and not give you the links. You want those links because they're expensive, okay? Straps. Straps will generally be used on the more, well, okay, on the right, it's a casual watch like the Radium, the Panerai. On the left, it's a very, very classic watch. So they're generally, that's kind of where they are. There's something kind of in the middle, which is the deployant strap. The deployant strap uses what would be a leather strap or a rubber strap or so on. And then it has the metal clasp on it so that it just makes it easier for you. And if you look at this one, you're going to see that it's multi-adjustable. So that makes it a lot easier. The positives are that it won't fall off your wrist by accident, which does happen. The negatives are sometimes that metal on the bottom here, when everything else is flexible, can be a little bit thick. You would not use this for a very, very elegant classic watch. For example, you would use it more for a sports watch that's trying to be kind of both things. Okay. Yeah. The case back. The case back is obviously on the back of the watch. They used to be very, very simple. All these things with watches used to be very, very simple because they were basically just a tool. Okay. For the one on the left, for example, this is what you would do with an old watch, and you would have it engraved for your father, your son, or congratulations, 50 years with Patek Philippe or something like that. In the middle is just an IWC where you have information about the back of on the back of the watch, but then you have an area where you can still engrave it. On the right, you have one that is just stylized because it's a very special watch or it's a limited edition. They will have the numbers on the back, for example. You could have an inset there. You could have a sapphire crystal inset that would show you a design, or you could have something just prettier there on the back. It can be multiple materials. You can have a solid case back. What we were talking about was all the solid case backs. Those are the ones on the left. They basically just protect your watch. The ones on the right are a clear case back. What that does is allows you to see the movement. And one positive thing is that if a manufacturer decides to put a clear case back on the watch, that means they tend to put a little bit more attention on the finishing of the watch because you're going to be looking at it. Okay, so that will be in waves. Someone like Patek or Lange or Montblanc will finish the daylights out of the back of that watch, whether you see it or not. But others, you could, for example, and there are aftermarket ways to do this. You could, for example, put a sapphire crystal case back on a originally solid case back, and then you just see what would be a rougher finished movement. Okay. In the middle is what they call an officer's case back. Again, kind of the best of both worlds, where you do have a clear case back that allows you to see things. And then on the side, you have one or two surfaces that you can actually engrave or personalize or put your own coat of arms or your own saying or whatever. An interesting thing here is this is not the case now, but historically, the finishing of a watch was an important guarantee of quality. And that was because the watchmaker would be very, very careful about engraving anything that didn't work, because if they did the engraving and then found out it didn't work, they would have wasted weeks or months of their time. So by engraving it, it kind of means it passed their first set of tests. That's a historical thing. That's not necessarily the case anymore. Nowadays, it's really more a visual aesthetic and luxury thing. Okay. There are other things you should know, and this is a type of stuff that we're going to get into a little bit deeper in with your questions, I assume. What are complications? Complications are anything past the hour, minute, and second hand. Okay, anything past that is what they call a complication. The basic start of it all is the second hand, center second hand, which allows, it's the second hand. When the second hand turns 60 seconds, then that moves the minute hand. Then the minute hand moves another 60 seconds, another 60 minutes. That's an hour. Okay, so that the key point is that second hand. That's what they call the center seconds. That's important because we're going to discuss other complications later. Okay, after that, after the hour, minute, and second hand, this is basically just time telling in its purest form. After that, you have calendars. Okay, the calendars will start with a date watch or a date watch, and it's just, you know, the hour will move the date and the day and so on. Then you have month, day, dates, and so on. Then you have other more complicated calendars. Once you get into other more complicated calendars, you will have a month. You may or may not have a visual year. Actually, some watches will have a visual year or a leap year. That's where it gets a little complicated, because if you have a regular calendar that has month, date, and day, or month and date, every 30th or 31st, you might have to adjust. If, for example, your month only has 30 days, you might have to move past manually to past 31 to 1, okay? Or if it's a leap year or not a leap year, you might have to move for 28, 29, 30, 31, 1. That's a regular calendar watch. Then you will have something like an annual calendar, which will keep track of all the 30, 31 dates, but not necessarily the leap year. Then you have a perpetual calendar. Perpetual calendar will handle everything up until your grandson looks at the watch. Okay, it uses a little cog that will snap every 4 years or open up every 4 years, and that will allow everything to sync up perfectly. These are very, very cool. They're very, very complicated, and they're insanely hard to reset if you forget to wind your watch. That's why a lot of perpetual calendar aficionados will have watch winders. This is something we can talk about. Again, do you need a watch winder or not? It depends on the watch. It depends on how intense you are. In all honesty, most collectors I know, if they forget to wind their watch, they will just go to the shop and say, "Can you please set this for me?" And they will. Okay. Chronographs. This is the interesting one. I find a chronograph is one of the most beautiful in terms of the movements. They can be the most beautiful movements on the inside, and they're the most gorgeous to look at on the outside. But we never use them. We maybe use them for timing our coffee in the morning or something like that. But there was a historical reason for them. Okay, and there are different uses and there are different complications within these chronographs. On the left, you see a Tag Heuer Carrera chronograph. Very, very basic in the sense that it has a sweep seconds. Remember, I told you that you had a time telling seconds and a sweep seconds. In this case, the sweep seconds, the center seconds hand is for the chronograph. So one of the other subdial hands will be the perpetually moving seconds hand. This is what tells you the second hand's in the middle, then the other two will give you minutes and quarter hours or hours as a total. In the middle, you have something which is really fun. This one is a Brigade Type 20 flyback. Now, this is a re-edition of some of their earlier watches, but Brigade's been doing this for quite a while. It's very, very popular. It's not necessarily the most traditional Brigade because it doesn't have the level of finishing that you expect from Brigade, but a lot of people, including myself, really, really like this watch. It's a flyback. A flyback is meant to snap the seconds hand and everything right back immediately, okay? Now, if you look at the watch on the left, which is the Carrera, when you start the watch, you hit the top button. When you stop it, you hit the top button. Then you reset using the bottom button, okay? The bottom push button. With a flyback, when you press the top button, you start it. Then when you press the bottom button, it will snap all the way right back. So you basically take out 1 or 2 steps. The reason for that is these are pilot's watches. And if you are a pilot flying at 50 to 100 feet, remember we're not talking 747s here, we're talking Sopwith Camels. Okay, so when you're flying and you're following your map, you need to fly for 30 minutes in this direction, and then you need to fly for 25.30 minutes in that direction. You do not want to say, okay, now it's time, click, make the move, click again, check it all in a cockpit with no light. You don't want to do that. So this just allows you to do it with one hack. So hack, make the turn, and you're already timed. So that's far more accurate. That's what the flybacks are for. On the right is a rattrapant or a split second. So that just allows two sweep second hands, two chronograph second hands, to time two different things. So you might be timing laps. You might be timing two different runners, two different horses, two different race cars. You might have one running for the whole race while the other one is running for laps. It might be that. It's far more complicated. They're beautiful. They're beautiful to look at. Just one thing is, in general, they're not going to be looking like that. The two blue hands you see on the far right of the Vacheron, that's there for beauty. In reality, they'll all be there like that. So there. What do we have left? The moon phase. The moon phase is actually an extension of the calendar. It basically just tells you the phase of the moon. It's beautiful. It's very, very pretty. You don't really need to know it. We like it because it's just a nice part of. Remember, if you go back into time and time telling and so on, it's linked very, very heavily to astronomy, okay, or astrology, okay, and that's how we defined time way back when, okay. And as a matter of fact, the development of the chronometer had to do with using the stars to tell where you are in the world in connection with a consistent timing mechanism, which is what we might discuss later about the H4 of John Harrison, who basically invented what ended up being called the chronometer. Okay, there are watches that will go further than this. For example, Martin Braun made some gorgeous watches before he got bought up by Frank Miller, where they would have two hands, two very, very thin, beautiful hands coming off the sides, and that would be the timing. That would tell you the tides. So do you need them? No. Are they beautiful? Yes. So, but again, these were all tools at one point. Okay, they were all things that you would have needed at some point. Okay, what else? Minute repeater. Okay, this is the minute repeater is considered the penultimate complication for many people, and this is where it's telling you the time, not visually, but by sound. If you look at the right, this is a Patek minute repeater. If you look at the right, you're going to see those two little hammers, and they will hit some gongs that circle the inside of the watch, and they will tell you the time very, very nicely by sound. This is not an alarm watch, which will go buzz or something. You're going to hear the beauty of the sound, and especially for Patek Philippe's, because they do not leave the factory unless either the father or son, Stern, listens to them and okays them. And you cannot buy this thing. You cannot walk in and say, I want a minute repeater. What you do is you go in and you say, dear Mr. Stern, I would like to buy a minute repeater. This is why I think I should have one. And basically your distributor will say, yes, he's a worthy person. It's kind of like Ferraris for the top end Ferraris, collectible ones. And it's not a marketing thing. It's just that they don't make that many of these things, and they don't really want them to go to people that won't appreciate them. So there. A tourbillon. This is an interesting one because there's an argument that a tourbillon is not a complication. Okay, and we will explain that. Tourbillons are when you see the spinning thing on the bottom of the watch, such as on this Vacheron. In general, that's supposed to be a tourbillon. Sometimes it will not be, especially in the less expensive watches. You just might see an open mainspring. Okay, so be very careful. No one's going to try and cheat you on this because it's almost impossible to do. But there's nothing wrong with having an open mainspring or an open heart movement. That's beautiful, but this is a different thing. And this was an answer to a problem that is non-existent in the modern age, which was this was built to be used on pocket watches. And pocket watches would either be in your pocket in this position or on your bedside in this position. And that meant that it could, lubrication could pool, friction could happen, all these things. So the tourbillon was a way to get everything constantly moving on different angles and on different degrees so that it would avoid that problem. Now, obviously, if your watch is on your wrist nowadays and you're doing that, it's no longer an issue. But so is it a complication? It does not add any function to the watch. It just makes it nowadays prettier to look at. And you can have one that is just a single axis, or you can have a double axis where it's going to move this way as well as this way, or it can be moving all over the place. They're gorgeous to look at. Do you actually use them as a function? No. But do you appreciate them? Yes. Okay. These are some other words you're going to be hearing if you are going into a very expensive watch shop. What is in-house manufacturing? In-house manufacturing is when everything is basically able to be done under one umbrella company. Now, this is this is kind of a gray area, okay, for a couple of reasons. For one, this is not historic. In general, except at the very, very beginning, people like the aforementioned John Harrison would make everything himself, but it took him years to do so. Now, then it got moved, actually got moved by people like IWC's F.A. Jones. They started making watches more, or JLC, they started making watches more assembly line in some ways, which meant that different people, because there are different skill sets. The guy that's making, let's say, the case that way is different from the guy that's going to make the mainspring, which is a tiny little spring that it's a hair of metal that you then wind. Okay, that skill set is completely different from the guy who's making the hands, or the guy who's putting enamel on the face. They're completely different skill sets. So in-house manufacturing was not a thing before. You would just buy the best product from the best person, or from whoever you could get it from. If you go to the Yegerlikut factory and you go outside past the honeybees, which they actually have great honey if you ever go there, and you're going to see a farmhouse. And that farmhouse is where all the people from the valley, because they can't plant over winter, they would be doing something else. They would be making watch parts, and they would bring all their watch parts there. And then the watchmakers of JLC would get together and say, okay, we're going to buy this, we're going to buy that, we're going to do this. And that's how that would happen. So all watches were always a collaborative effort. Okay. That has changed because, well, several reasons. One is because the market's just kind of shrunk. And there's a whole history to that, which we can discuss later if you want to get into it. It's really, really interesting. But it's also because at one point, the Swatch Group, which kind of owns a lot of these things now, including Breguet and the movement maker ETA and Unitas and so on, they kind of decided, you know, there's no more development because you guys are all using the watch movements that we make, so we're going to stop selling them to you. That took a long time because all the Swiss were saying that's anti-monopolistic and so on. End result was you now have in-house manufacturing movements as a big deal that they are trying to tout. Is this a positive thing or a negative thing? That really, really depends. It's a positive thing for the brands because they can now build everything themselves after they learn how. And trust me, it's not easy to learn how to make this stuff. And that's why there was a whole line of watches that just didn't do very well when they first did in-house manufacturing. But also it allows them to control things. The negatives are if you are the guy who buys the watch and it's an in-house manufacturer movement, sometimes you really need to only go back to the factory or to the official service center to fix it. That's fine if the watch is not something you need on a daily basis. But if it's something that you really, really want, you can't just go down to the corner store and have them make something. You can do that if it's an ETA movement, the Unitas movement, Seiko movement, or whatever. There's a lot of Valjoux movement, actually. A lot of people locally are trained to use those and to repair those and to find the parts for them. But as you get further up the complication ladder or the expensive ladder, there are going to be less and less people that can make this watch, especially if you get into something. A minute or Peter better go back to Switzerland, no question. Perpetual calendars, yes. Chronographs, chronometers, it really depends. So just understand that when you are buying an expensive watch, you're also buying into the whole, it's like buying a Ferrari or a Porsche. You better understand how much you're going to be paying for maintenance. Okay. That is changing, by the way. There's a lot of new stuff there. There are watches now that don't need to be over for the next 10 years. So it really, really depends. Okay, here's another thing. The in-house manufacturing thing is a big deal for the Swiss and for a lot of people. In reality, some people like Grand Seiko, they just started making everything themselves because no one else did. They just like when they started making cars. Same thing with this. They just started making everything on their own. So they don't really call it, well, they call it now in-house because it's a big deal. But in reality, they just always made their stuff themselves anyway. So it kind of comes down to you whether or not you think this is that important to you. But it is changing. And it is going to be a function of more and more watch companies. What's happening now actually is that the bigger brands or the mid-sized brands are learning to make their own stuff because they don't want to be beholden to the movement makers. But because of that, there is a whole nother level of people who are working outside the Swatch at Unitas, Valjoux movement makers who are jumping in to fill the gap. And they are selling very nice movements, largely based on the same thing, to be honest, that are going into other watch, and they're going to a lot of these smaller new watchmakers, and this is kind of a big deal because there's a lot of movement past the huge expensive watch companies. There's a whole groundswell of enthusiast support and production support that's coming in at a lower level. If you go on a Kickstarter, the crowdfunding campaign, and you look at the number of watches that are being offered, there's like at any given time 10, 20 watches. If you look at the Philippine market, the Philippines has 3 or 4 or 5 different watch companies right now that you probably never heard of. Some of them are good, some of them are not. Some of them are really, really interesting. Some of them are not at all. But the fact that there are people trying to do this, and they're not sourcing their movements from ETA. They're sourcing their movements from these smaller watchmakers. They might well be Japanese. They might well be Chinese. Remember that a movement itself, once you get past the beautiful finishing and so on, it's basically a mechanically produced thing. Okay, and in all honesty, let's be fair. Right now, the Chinese have just as much quality going on in their factories as anyone else. It just comes down to how you handle it. So, okay, there we go. Maintenance and repair. Let's talk about that. Remember that you got to repair these watches. You got to have them serviced from time to time. They do have a schedule. In all honesty, they're friends of mine in the watch industry. When I say, how often should I service? They go like, is there a problem? No. Are you losing time? No. Then don't open it. Because there is actually such a thing called service-induced problems, which is the minute you open up a watch, the minute you open up the case back, you've got issues of atmosphere, you've got issues of water, you've got issues of dust, you've got any number of things that happen once you open that thing up. So you don't want that. And quite often you might solve one problem, only create another. These are hugely, hugely intricate pieces, okay? So nowadays, there are watches that are saying, no, you don't have to open us up for 10 years. You don't need lubrication. That's another thing. Lubrication has changed drastically. Just like with your cars, lubrication for watches has changed drastically. So nowadays, you don't have this thing where you have degradation or friction causing little pebbles to end up in your watch movement. There are some watches that don't have any lubrication anymore because the parts themselves are made of material that doesn't need it anymore. Okay, so this is changing. But do understand, the more complicated a watch is, the more complicated it will be to service and repair. And just please understand that these are not your basic Seiko dive watches. These are insanely complicated, highly collectible pieces if you go that direction. So just be aware of that. Who makes the best servicing? A commitment to the world, arguably Rolex and Tudor, because they just know that that's part of their heritage. There's a reason for them doing that. And we can get into that, by the way, later as to what you need to look out when you go for servicing. Traveling with watches, a few more things. Do you want to travel with your watch? Yes, we always say bring your baby with you wherever you go. Having said that, over the last 2 years, if you want to travel around with a Daytona or a GMT, you better watch your wrist. And we're not talking about going somewhere in the Bronx or wherever. We're talking about outside Harrods, or we're talking about the train station in Basel or Geneva. It's so high profile now that it's worth it for them to mess with you just for one watch, and it's so visible. And also, just even things like you know, going through customs or going through security check in the airport. You take the watch off, you kind of forget about it sometimes. So bring a watch case. In this case, the one on the left is just something you get from Rolex. That's what you get if you service your watch. Bring that along with you, so that make it a habit. I mean, if you are watching this webinar, basically you're traveling a whole lot. Remember to put your watch in a case and put it in a dedicated position in your bag and take it out as soon as you're done, because you would be surprised at how many watches I have found that were left. Okay. Storage, one quick thing. Storage for this, your main fight will be with humidity, dust, and so on. There are any number of great watch cases. You can put them in batches, you can put them in singles. One thing to remember is if you put them in a safe, if you want a watch winder, you either have to have a battery powered watch winder or a safe that can run power through it. So where do you buy the watches? Nowadays, if you want a watch like this, you're hugely lucky if you can buy it from the boutique. If not, you're looking at the secondary market. Remember that you are always buying the seller before you are buying the piece. It's just like land. Buy the people you trust. Don't buy it from anybody. You can have way more problems than you expect. Okay, so you can also buy online. It's far more easy to buy online. So there we go. One last thing, and we can talk about this later. Watch this as a gift. Don't make the watch the gift, make the journey the gift. Bring your wife along with you when you choose the watch. Talk about it, travel with it, enjoy it, so that when you finally have it, it's an experience that took a year to happen. Plus, it takes all the problems of you getting the wrong watch away. Trust me, that makes your life a whole lot better. Thank you very much. David, we are back. I hope I didn't go too far.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carl. That was great. Yeah, you're right about that last slide. I bought a watch for my wife. Guess what? She's never used it. It's been like,
I know, right?
It's been like 20 years. I saved a lot of money for that watch. I was really proud of it. She's never worn it. It's just sitting in her closet somewhere. Okay, we've got a lot of questions, really interesting questions, Carl, for you. I have some of my own. Let me just start with this term that you mentioned earlier, but let's get deeper into it. Chronometers, okay? It gets confusing to some buyers. They walk into a store, they're offered a watch that's called chronometer certified, and a watch that isn't chronometer certified. Then it gets even more confusing because it's a COSC certified movement versus a METAS movement, certified movement. And then you have brands like Rolex, Patek Philippe that have their own way of certifying their movements. So walk us through the importance of a chronometer and the importance of it being certified. And is it worth the extra money to go for the chronometer?
Okay. The word chronometer actually came from, if you remember when I was talking about John Harrison, who made the watches that allowed you to travel on the ocean and not go into a wall. That was when they first used the word chronometer by anybody, because they were supposed to be more accurate. And the word chronometer now, there's no real, I mean, if you look at the Swiss, you can only call the Swiss watch a certified chronometer if it goes through something like COSC. COSC is a certification body within Switzerland. Japan has one as well. Germany has one as well. Okay, so is it important for you to have a certified chronometer? Yeah, kinda. It's not high on my list. It's kind of the first thing you think about because it's cool and it's a way to define things and so on. But you're mentioning METAS. COSC has a certain level. METAS has a higher level. Basically, you take the COSC movement and you then subject it to harder hurdles, and that's the METAS movement. Also, yes, some brands will have their own. It's also remember that this is just a certification right outside, that's the factory. Once it's out of the factory, that there's no connection to it whatsoever. So you're certifying precision and consistently over that early period. That is not necessarily a guarantee of anything other than that. Okay, you could bang that thing out the door and you could have a change. Okay, that's why a lot of enthusiasts like checking their time all the time. You can do that by just timing how off you are from your computer, or you can have like movements that you can have mechanisms that listen to your watch and tell you it's ticking too fast or ticking too slow. Those are kind of fun too. But basically, it's just that. A lot of it is a marketing thing, but okay, it might be a marketing thing now, but the watches before were hugely inaccurate pieces. They were inconsistent. That's why people like Rolex really did well, because they suddenly produced watches that were reliable and that were consistent. So the chronometer function, while now it's arguably largely a marketing thing, in reality, it was meant to answer again a need, which was we need to guarantee someone that this thing came out of the factory on time.
All right, okay. So safe to say, if you're buying a watch from a reputable brand, you don't have to worry too much about it being chronometer certified. Okay.
Not necessarily, yeah.
All right, more questions, Carl. We only have like 10 minutes for this, I think. Let's go to some of the other questions. Yeah, self-winding versus manual winding, two very different things if you're a watch buyer, but sometimes you don't even know what you're buying, right? When you walk into the store, they just say it's a mechanical movement. Why is this important to know the difference?
Okay, a mechanical movement is the one we discussed where it's just mechanisms and metal. There's no battery inside or whatever. Okay, that's one thing. The mechanical movement can be self-winding or it can be a manual wind. Self-winding means you gotta wind it yourself. Okay, this is a self-winding. I don't know if you can see it. This is a self-winding Tissot movement. You gotta wind it yourself. There is no rotor on the back of it. Okay, for a self-winding movement, you have a rotor in the back. If you remember some of the other photos we showed, that rotor does this. When it does that, it's winding the movement. Okay, so that's what you would call a self-winding or automatic movement. There are cases for either one. If you have one watch, you may as well make it automatic because you're never gonna have to set it again. If you have a lot of watches, you're gonna have to wind it again anyway. So I just spent 5 minutes winding watches. So there. And only one of them was manual on.
Oftentimes it's individual preference, right?
Yeah, it really is. Also, there's one thing. If you're looking at the back of an open case or a see-through case watch, sometimes the beautiful moves like the Minerva mechanical manual wind movements are gorgeous because you don't have the rotor interfering. So you see the whole watch and it's really, really beautiful. A lot of people, myself included, really, really love the beauty of these vintage or modern manual wind movements.
Okay. And some people just love the sound of the watch winding closer to the ears.
Yeah,
Let's go to a question from Ernest, Carl.
Yes.
Simple question, but really great one because it's really simple. What are some things to remember in buying my first important watch? I love that he calls it an important watch. I mean, how do you even define an important watch?
Okay.
This is not necessarily an expensive watch, right?
No, not necessarily.
Important watch would be something, I guess, worth a person feels it's precious.
Yeah. Well, okay. I don't want to make the definition of fashion watches versus real watches because they're all important to the peers and people that are buying them. But I guess the best definition would be for the auction houses. Okay, you can have, they'll call it an important watch because it's significant. There's something important about it. It's not just a simple, I wouldn't call a simple old Seiko dive watch important in the sense that there are just so many of them, but you would call your first Speedmaster an important watch. Okay, I'm not talking down Seikos or Grand Seikos at all. I love them, but there's also a question of volume, and also the word importance comes from the perception of the people. Okay, remember a lot of this is perception, and a lot of the value comes from what people are willing to pay for it. And arguably, that's not the case because it's just not. But at the same time, that's how the stock market works. That's how the land market works. The value is what someone's willing to pay for it. Okay, so those are the important watches. It can be, when you're talking about an important watch, it just comes down to, I would say, the amount of money and time you put into it. You're not just walking in, oh, that looks cute, I'll buy it. You're thinking about it. Okay, and it's something that you will have around. And these are pieces that, even an inexpensive watch from 80 years ago could still mean something to your grandson or your great grandson.
True. I have a Swatch from 1984. That's an important watch.
No, okay. They're great. Some of those are great, huh?
Carl, more questions. Okay, keep them coming. All right. More. This is a question about the current luxury spending landscape because of the pandemic. Is sales accelerating? And I have my own question related to that. Is it a seller's market right now or a buyer's market? A bit of both. What are you hearing from around the world?
It's both. It's definitely both. It is a seller's market for people like Rolex and Patek, but it's also very dependent on the brand and the model. Okay, it's a seller's market for a lot of the up and comers, a lot of the new makers like Kurono Tokyo. Louis Erard's not new, but he's doing new stuff. There's who else? Yeah, there's a lot. It's no longer one market. It's no longer even 5 markets. Okay, there are all these different little niche markets. As an example, the market for a steel Daytona is historically completely different from the market for a gold Rolex Daytona. They're different market, different people buying them, and the steel one's far more interesting in general and historically. The market for a Patek Nautilus is very different from the market for a minute repeater from Patek Philippe. Completely different market. Okay, so these are all little niche markets. Even within $2,000, $3,000 watch range, there's a huge amount of interest from these new makers. And I'm not talking about big makers. I'm talking about guys like you or me who would start a watch company and try and do something. And people are appreciating that. They're appreciating a personal connection. One of the things with these small companies is that you can talk to the guy that's making the watch or the guy whose idea it was. I can put you together with the guys from Clo & Co in the Philippines, and they're just hugely passionate people from Ateneo that are making their own watch.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much to Cap for that question. We're running out of time
Hi,
for
Cap.
this part at least, but here's a question from Raymond. Some believe it isn't ideal to use electronic watch winders to store your watches. You kind of mentioned this, but can you go into more detail about that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, there are watch winders and then there are electronic watch winders. Those are kind of two different things. A watch winder would be just something that kind of moves your watch around like that. An electronic watch winder is something that you can program so that if you want to get really, really deeply into it, especially for vintage watches, some watches will only wind if you go a certain way. Some watches can get overwound. So if you're talking about electronic watch winders, then you're able to choose or program how often it does something in a particular way. So that's very important for very expensive or very old watches. Do most people use watch winders? You can use them. I personally don't, but I also don't have annual calendars or perpetual calendars. So it's not an issue to me.
Okay, actually, there are a lot of questions, but we're saving those for the next session because a lot of those questions, Carl, understandably, are about specific brands, specific models. But let me just end this part with a question that I think is also important. And a lot of people come across this discussion in watch stores and in watch circles. Handcrafted versus industrialized methods of manufacturing watches. A lot of it's marketing as well, but a lot of it's also, genuine. Is there really a difference between, does it make a difference? Handcrafted, hand finished, hand assembled, and on the other hand, assembly line watches are industrialized methods of producing watches.
Okay. In general, almost every watch nowadays will have a component of mechanical production because you just cannot spend your time making all the little pieces anymore. You just cannot do it. Greubel Forsey has a program where they are teaching people how to make all the tiny little parts themselves. And they make like one at a time because they're trying to not lose that craftsmanship. Okay. So in this case, when they're talking about handcrafted, usually meaning you're going to get the stuff out of a machine for things like a plate, a billet, whatever, and then you're going to finish it, or then you're going to tune it in a particular way. You're going to see that in the finishing primarily. You're going to the finishing of the watch, the way, the engraving, and then finishing is not just kind of polishing it off. Okay, it's like let's say if you're trying to finish the surface of a small part inside the watch, you can do that in like 5 different ways, bare minimum. And people like Vacheron Constantin have 5 different choices for the finishing that they will do. That's just to basically create the surface of the watch. Okay. Then you have any number of things. You can have handmade dials. You can have handmade hands. But nowadays, you can say handcrafted, but in reality, almost everything is coming out of machines. It's if not, you'd be paying huge prices. People like Hajime Asaoka, he'll hand make his stuff. Yeah, and there's no more wait list on it because it just can't be done.
So yeah, best to understand the watchmaking jargon before you buy that watch, because you gotta know the nuances about these terms.
Yeah.
So thanks, Carl. Let's move on now to the next portion. So once again, to all our viewers, thanks so much for your questions. We have a lot more. We'll tackle those later on. So thank you for those who sent in their questions earlier. That was a great start because we're only really halfway through this session, believe it or not. And for those with specific questions about watch brands to consider and which watch models to look out for, now this next part of the program will cover those questions of yours. So because we only have 20 minutes, unfortunately, there are hundreds of watch brands to talk about. Carl can only really cover a handful of these brands. And because these brands on his list have released more models than we have time to spare, Carl will likewise just pick perhaps a couple of new releases worth talking about. Anyway, you'll have more time for other questions about these brands and models in the open forum later. So let's waste no time and bring back Carl Cunanan. I can't wait for this. Carl, go ahead.
Okay, watch brands and why we like them. We're not going to talk about the ones we dislike. Okay. What is behind all these names really? There are histories. We think of it as marketing, but in reality, as we have said before, there's always a technical reason or historic reason for why they are who they are. For example, Rolex. Rolex is a made-up name, basically. It was created by Hans Wilsdorf, the guy on the left, and he was creating an answer to a need at the time, which was reliable, robust, consistent watches. He just happened to be brilliant at marketing as well. So he made up the Rolex name. He marketed the heck out of it, but it was honestly just something that really worked when nothing else would. He would put it on the lady that swam the English Channel. He would put it on Sir Edmund Hillary as he climbed the mountaintop. So, and then he followed it up. He followed it up with a massive effort of service so that your watch was always guaranteed. As long as you brought it back to them and paid for it, they would guarantee that it would keep on running as long as they could make it keep on running. That's their product. This year, what did they release? They released a couple different things. The one on the left is a Rolex Datejust 36. I call it the leafy green dial. It's actually fun. It's a fun dial. In the pictures, it looks very, very crisp. In reality, if it's on your wrist, it's like a texture more than anything else. So it's just kind of fun to look at. It's similar to, if we talk about the Brigade Type 20, a carbon fiber. It just becomes a texture. It doesn't deter readability in any way. On the right is the Rolex Explorer 2. This is a fun watch. And this is the last sports watch that doesn't have a ceramic dial anymore. And that's kind of half and half because some people wanted it to move ceramic. I personally did not because I never bought one and I really wanted that one. So I'm happy that they did this. The new one fits a bit better on your wrist. It's a bit easier to read. There are other, I mean, okay, these are the two novelties. Every time they release a watch, it's called a novelty for the year. These are the novelties from Rolex. But there are other ones that came back, which are kind of important. The Batman, which is the blue and black GMT, which Rolex doesn't call it Batman, but everybody else does. That came back. The Pepsi GMT is still there, but now those are both available in the two different bracelets. One of which is the basic standard you see on the Rolex Explorer 2. The other one is a Jubilee, which is a little bit more flexible, may or may not be a little bit more flashy. We actually, when you put both of them together, it's up to you. But these are all just small changes for things that are happening. Tudor is also, it was created by Mr. Wilsdorf as well, when he wanted to create watches that, you know, he basically nailed the market for Rolex. So he wanted to create watches that were a bit more accessible, a bit more affordable, but still as accurate as they needed to be. If you look at the marketing for this, it's not someone climbing Mount Everest. It's a guy working on a jackhammer or riding a motorcycle. Okay, so this is meant to be the more solid watch. If Rolex at the time used higher end movements and they don't understand, remember we talked about before, where did they make their own movements? Not necessarily. Some of the most collectible movements from the Rolex Daytona are made by Zenith. Okay, so it's very, very different. Modern Tudors, some have movements made by Breitling and Breitling has some movements made by Tudor. It still happens. Okay, the modern, and okay, remember this watch on the left because we're going to talk about it later. That's the Black Bay Chrono. In this case, it is a reverse Panda. This is a watch. If you talk to the watch guys nowadays, there's been far more interest, honestly, in what Tudor is doing, other than as compared to what Rolex is doing nowadays. Because Rolex has to operate within certain levels of or certain parameters. They can't really bounce out, whereas Tudor can kind of play and do different things. So on the left is a Black Bay Chrono. This is the latest edition. There are two of them. One is a white face with black dial, and this one is a black face with kind of a silver dial. We've discussed these at length. They feel great on the wrist. We can discuss them more if you want, and we'll give you our opinion if you want. On the right is the Black Bay 58 Bronze Boutique Edition. Pay attention to this because you're going to see something else similar to this later on. Tudor does not usually make boutique editions, and this is their first one, I think. It is a bronze watch with a bronze bracelet. Now, Tudor treats bronze in a different way. They do not want this gross, grungy green thing to happen to your watch, although a lot of people like it, myself included. They don't want to do that. So they have a kind of a stabilized bronze. Okay. So basically these are the Tudor is taking chances that Rolex just can't take. Rolex couldn't take these chances, Tudor can. Patek Philippe. You never actually own a Patek Philippe. You merely look after it for the next generation. That's not the way they think about their watches. That's the way they think about their lives. In all honesty, if you talk to these guys, and we do, they are shepherds of the watch industry, not just of their own brand, but of the entire industry. And that's how they think. If you talk to them, they don't talk about this year or next year. They talk about what's going to happen generations from now. And they honestly do feel that way. They are independent. They are a family-owned company. There aren't that many of them left. They are very, very careful of their heritage. Example, okay, this is an odd example, but these are the watches that people like right now. And what other company would take the most sought after watch and stop making it? Patek would. Okay, the Nautilus, they're stopping the Nautilus. They're not going to make it anymore because it's just not, it is, the Nautilus is by far not the most beautiful, complicated, or emblematic Patek Philippe ever. It's really, really not. It's a very, very simple watch. It's arguably low-hanging fruit, if you want to go that way about it. But people just got really into it, largely because internet algorithms told them that it's the coolest watch. There's nothing wrong with it. I love it, but it's not in any way the best example of what Patek Philippe brings to the world. On the left is the Aquanaut Lucha Travel Time. This is a quartz watch, okay? This is a quartz watch for ladies. And it's important because this is their first travel time for this quartz ladies line. But again, what we said, it's a simple watch. You don't need to break your nail changing the time or whatever. So there. Who else? Tag Heuer. Tag Heuer is a brand we really, really like. And this came from our car geek stuff. We remember Heuer from speed shops more than we do from watch shops. Before we ever went into watch shops, we were hanging out in speed shops and car tuners and car parts shops and so on. And we would see Heuer. If anybody remembers FCC on Ortigas Avenue, they would have Heuer displays. And I went back there many, many years later to try and find them, and someone else bought them all. But Heuer has a history with car racing and motor racing that is real more than it is marketing early on. But it also has history in watchmaking with people like Jack Heuer, who actually built some of these iconic watches. And you have Steve McQueen, who actually, they used this watch, they used these watches in the movies, yes, but this was kind of before all the craziness of marketing, okay? So what is available now, we're going through, all these are novelties that we're showing you right now. On the left, okay, just quick note, I love the Monaco. I'm a big fan of the Monaco. It's my favorite. A lot of people don't like square watches. I do. Some people will go for the Carreras. I particularly like this Carrera. It's the 160th anniversary limited edition. It has nice little tinges of color on a very, very clean face. I really like that. They've tried to do this before, and I haven't bought it before because I didn't like the way it felt. And even honestly, Jack Heuer agreed with me and said that was just a bad time in our history. This one is spot on, and I love it. On the right is a Monaco Titan Special Edition. It's titanium. It's very simple, very clean. I really like it, but I still like this one even more, the blue face one. Okay. Oris. Oris is another independent brand. We bring it up because we just like who they are. All these other, okay, except for Tag Heuer, all the watches we have talked about now, all the brands are all independent brands. Tag Heuer is part of the LVMH group, Louis Vuitton and Hennessy, and they're part of a conglomerate that owns different watch companies. All these other watch companies are owned by themselves, basically. Oris is an independent watch company, and it comes out of a tiny town named Holstein with a river named Oris. But it's a company that just kind of does their own thing. They don't make a huge amount of watches, but the watches they make are interesting and fun. On the left is the Oris Divers Holstein edition, which is also, remember what we said, this is a bronze bracelet watch. Not many of them exist. They have a Holstein edition, which is their answer to a boutique edition. Boutique editions are watches that you can buy. Let's say you go to Panerai in Florence and you can buy a particular really beautiful engraved watch. You can only buy it there. You can buy some watches you can only buy, let's say, a particular AP in Paris or whatever. Oris doesn't like that because they feel their market is global. So they just created one boutique edition that's called the Holstein edition that's available to anybody. And they do it on a yearly basis. On the right, as an example, this is their Big Crown Pro Pilot with their own caliber. In their case, they don't want to just make a movement to make a different kind of a movement. They want to do something special. In this case, these things are massively long-lasting movements, which they make themselves. And if you look at these things, you're going to have that little mainspring, the barrel that holds all the power. It's like hugely long. And it's just nice because it shows you that smaller companies can concentrate and do their own thing and create pieces that are different and unique. And I guarantee you that you will see less of these watches on the wrist than you will GMTs and Submariners and so on. Mont Blanc. Mont Blanc, this is an interesting one. I'm putting it here because it is an example of old school and new school in a lot of ways. Mont Blanc, as we all think of it, is traditionally the pen maker and then the luxury goods maker. But understand that strength of the luxury market gives them huge power to do other things. They bought the Minerva workshop in Villeray while they were developing the Mont Blanc manufacturer in Le Loc. What that means is they essentially, if people are talking about having one manufacturer, these guys actually have two. Okay. And remember, I spoke a while back on the beautiful hand wound movements of Mont Blanc, of Minerva, sorry. They have access to these. And these are just, I mean, no one else could do this because you need to have the power of Mont Blanc. Okay, Mont Blanc is another group brand. It is under the Richemont Group. Richemont Group is arguably the house that Cartier built. So they have a lot of power and they have the ability to do this and to create these things. Their modern watches, this is where, what I like about Mont Blanc is that they have these really, really nice, well-finished movements that will appeal only to collectors who are past everything else and just like it because they appreciate it. But they also have pieces like these, which are, on the left is the Geosphere limited edition, 1858. This one is basically an homage to Crossing the Desert by this guy. And it's a travel watch, but it doesn't look like any other travel watch. So they did their own thing. On the right is the 1858 automatic 24-hour, which is a one-hand watch. Remember, we were talking two-hand. This is a one-hand watch. And this is what watch they call the regulator. The regulator came from the clock you would have on a factory wall where everyone would look at and know exactly what time it was. You wouldn't have two hands, you just have one because they were only telling you one thing. If it might be the hour or it might be the minutes if you're making watches because you want to know when exactly the minute comes in. So it would be very, very clear. This is a regulator watch. I've never really liked regulator watches. I like two-hand watches. I don't find these things balanced. However, I really like this one and I like it because Mont Blanc just flipped it around, basically. Normally on a 24-hour regulator watch, the 24-hour midnight will be at the top. That's a date change, right? So obviously would be at the top. But that means that basically you're looking at the bottom of the watch half the day for a 24-hour watch. I never really like that. I like this because it makes sense. It's pointing upwards for the daytime hours. It's pointing down for the nighttime hours. So I really like it. The only other regulator I really like is the one from Patek Philippe. So there. IWC is actually American. It was started by an American named Florentine Ariosto Jones. He was an entrepreneur who sailed to Europe to make his fortune. And he made his fortune in power generation, not by electricity, but by like taking water turbines and taking that power through axles all the way into a town, which is why, by the way, they developed factories near water sources because they were able to use the power generation. So he produced watches using that power. And that is where IWC, with International Wristwatch, located in Schaffhausen, came from. Interesting point. If you ever go to Schaffhausen, which you should, to visit the IWC factory and museum, if you walk back to the train station, keep your eye out because on a wall, you will see a plaque of José Rizal, because apparently at one point he hung out there and stayed in a hotel there. So there. IWC, what we like about IWC is that they are, again, part of the Richemont Group, so they have a large company backing them. They have like 7 different lines. So there's always something that's being refreshed in IWC. There's always something you will like in your time of life and so on. On the left is the Big Pilot's watch, Shock Absorber XPL, which is basically, if you look at it, you can see all around it, it's a big watch, the movement of which is kind of bolstered by a shock absorbing system. It's just kind of fun technology. On the right is a more relaxed one. It's a Big Pilot watch, Top Gun Edition, Mojave Desert. They do have some kind of collaboration with the Naval Fighter Weapons School. So, but IWC is always one of those companies that you can always walk in and find something really fun. There's no question whether you want the Aqua Timer or whether you want something classic. like a Portofino or an engineer. There's always something interesting there. Grand Seiko. This is where we go. People keep asking us about Grand Seiko. We were looking at Grand Seiko and Seiko for decades, in all honesty. And most people weren't paying any attention to it. That was largely because they weren't in certain markets. For example, they weren't actually in the US market for a very long time. They didn't get any attention other than people who would travel, which would be American servicemen. If you talk to Navy SEALs, for example, in all honesty, they love them because they could get them and they were robust little watches. Okay, we're going to be talking about Grand Seiko. Grand Seiko is now a second model line. It used to be within Seiko. It is now branched out to something else. It's kind of like Lexus and Toyota, if you want to look at it that way. Now, Grand Seiko, they have a completely different aesthetic. They have a very, very Japanese vision to what they want and what they will produce. In this case, this is their new studio in Shizuguishi, which is near Mount Iwata. So all these guys are looking out to the wonderful Japanese world at mountaintop when they're making their watches. So it makes them calm. It influences, okay, we can go back. If you look at Mont Blanc, okay, go to a Mont Blanc webinar we're doing, because we're going to talk to the watchmaker and show you that there's a movement piece inside there that actually they made because it looks like the mountains outside their workshop. Same thing here. These guys are looking outside. The Grand Seiko designers and watchmakers are looking outside what they see when they walk to work, when they look outside their window. On the left, the GMT is, the Shosho GMT is supposed to be an homage to the wrinkling of water that they see at a certain time of spring. On the right is a 140th anniversary limited edition, which is a hugely engraved watch. This is a spring drive, by the way. We're talking about spring drives and collectability. This is a spring drive, which means it takes a rotor, mechanical power movement that runs through electronic movement to create this high precision. And this is an example of, in this case, people love to have the smoothness of the spring drive dial, the spring drive second hand moving. It's just very, very smooth. But there are other companies that say, no, we want the hacking. We want crisp, clean movement of the watch. So it really comes down to what you want. It really, really does. And each watch brand, honestly, will like tout their own stuff more, right? Okay. Okay, this is another flyer. This is the Max Busser and Friends Legacy Machine 101, 2021 edition. Max Busser is a watchmaker guy that has a lot of friends. He has people, in other words, he will partner. These are all collaborative efforts. He will make watches that are collaborations with Carrie Buttolinen or any number of people. I like this one because it is more, it's more traditional. Some of his other stuff is far, far more funky. I like this one. These are watches that you basically, you know, they're not even available in most markets. You kind of got to contact them or go to the few places in the world that it is available. But this is an example. If you go past all the other collections and you want to find something different, this is where you would go. Will these increase in value like Nautiluses and Daytonas? We don't know, and they won't promise you that they will, because they're not making it to make you money. They're making it because these are examples of beauty and craftsmanship, and that's what they want.
Been wanting this watch. It could be a Rolex, a Patek Philippe, it could be an Audemars Piguet, whatever it is. But you're on the waiting list. Explain, what is a waiting list? How do you get on that waiting list? And when is it time to maybe just move on to something else?
Okay. Waiting lists, that's what everyone talks about now. But in reality, this is not, there are only so many watches they're going to make, right? Okay. And the Philippines generally, we weren't a big buyer of these watches before. So we would always have a small allotment for them. Nowadays, all of a sudden, everybody's suddenly into watches. And let's be very clear, there's an argument that this time more than any other in history, there has been more interest in mechanical or important watches than there ever has been at several levels, okay? There's an entire generation of people who did not wear watches, but younger people are now wearing watches again, and they're getting used to it. And even the smart watches that people said are going to kill off the market, in reality, they're good for the market because it means people are putting watches on their wrist. And once they do, they realize, okay, I've got the same watch as 100,000 other people. How am I going to make that different? Okay. Also, nowadays, more people are looking at what they wear more carefully than probably I did when I was in college, right? So it's more important. So there are people who are buying multiple watches because they want a different look, and they're doing this at a lower level. I mean, we're not talking about expensive watches. We're talking about inexpensive fashion watches. And then once they get there, then they start moving around. And then there is a progression here. And we were telling this to people, and they were saying, "Why are you talking about Seiko? Why are you talking about Swatch?" I'm like, "Yeah, just wait until they start moving up," and they're all moving up.
And quickly back to my question,
Sorry.
how did get into that waiting list?
Okay, how to get to the waiting list? Okay.
I mean, how to
first,
get ahead of that waiting list, rather.
okay, well, everybody wants to do that, and it's not going to happen. Basically, it comes down to number one, go to the shop, put your name down, and just pay attention, because sometimes, quite often, they might call you once they have a bunch of watches in. If you were there and then they come in the next day, they might well call you, and that has happened. I have friends who have walked into a shop, and the number one JLC is there, and they're able to get it. There's a lot of negative feeling going around about this, saying like, "Oh, I'm not a big enough buyer," or "I'm not an important enough buyer." A lot of people think they're really important buyers, and it hurts them when they're not. But there are some who are really important buyers, and they're not spending huge amounts of money. They might just be consistent friends over the years, people that they know aren't going to flip watches and sell them right away. There was a time when, not now, but like 2 years ago, I was actually asked by certain brands, "Can you tell me who won't flip this watch, and I will sell it to whoever you want me to sell it to?" That's not the case anymore, because they're just the prices are just so high that it's hard. So how to get onto that list? Basic way: buy some of their other watches, pay attention to them, talk to them, be involved with them. That's kind of the best way, unless you want to go to the secondary market.
We'll be talking about that in a while, because there's a question about that. But first, let me go to the questions from our audience. This is from Roseanne. Do you consider a watch an investment? Simple question, but it opens up a whole discussion about, should watches be purchased as an investment, or for personal pleasure, for handing over to the next generation? What do you think?
Okay, let's define investment as an investment vehicle, just like anything else, just like land, just like stocks, just like bonds. Okay, looking at it that way, you have to use the same parameters of understanding. These are not, right now, and in the last 3 or 4 years, it's a very, very aberrant market. Any sports model Rolex will have made you money. Any Patek Nautilus could have made you money if you sold it. That's very, very unusual. And it also, there are times when these watches were not popular at all. Nautiluses weren't popular at one point. Hoyers weren't popular at one point, then they skyrocketed. So as an investment, you need to know a lot about it. And if you want to buy a brand new one, right now, if you can buy a brand new GMT or Daytona, yes, you could turn around and sell it. The minute you do that, you're never going to get another one at SRP from that boutique, because they're going to know what you did, because they do keep track of all these things, and they're watching you on social media, and they're taking your name down. So as an investment, having said that, if you pour millions of pesos or millions of dollars into this, yes, treat it as an investment. Take care of it, understand it. You need to understand that these are all niche markets within niche markets. Okay, a vintage market for this brand is different from a vintage market for that brand. You got to treat it with the same level of understanding. There's some very, very positive things to watches as investments. If you look at a car, let's say, if you look at a car and you buy even a collectible car, then as soon as in general, once a car leaves the showroom, it kind of drops in value. Watches in general, and I'm going to use a Breguet Type 20 as an example. If it's a $10,000 watch, it will drop down. Then it's going to stay at maybe $5,000, $6,000, and it's going to stay there historically. It's kind of not going to move down from there. Okay, because you're also coming up with, that there are less and less watches available, and so on. So it's a market thing. So watches do tend to stabilize more than other things. They're easier to care for than cars. They're easier to care for than artwork in a lot of ways. They're easier to care for than wines. They don't require a lot of care. So there are positives and negatives, but insure them. If you look at them at that point, insure them.
All right. Okay. And if you can't sell them, it shouldn't matter, because if you love that watch, you'll be happy to keep it anyway. All right. What brand would you recommend for new collectors? That's a tough question, putting you on the spot, but let me just add something to this. How would you even define a collectible watch? Because even that's debatable.
Yes, the word collectible is thrown around way too much right now. We are in a world where we have collectible McDonald's wrappers with BTS, right? So this makes no sense. The word collectible is just thrown around way too much. Okay. I would rather use important. Yeah, I would turn around and ask the question, what is it you want for your watch? It's easy to give you X number of brands, okay, which may or may not fit. If you are a hugely wealthy individual and I'd start you off with Swatch, you're not going to like it. But if you have a X amount of money and you're looking at something inexpensive, then start you off with a Seiko and you'll be fine. It really depends. The answer for the crowd that we're at right now, I would say start with Tudors, Omegas, Rolexes.
Okay, speaking
Some
of
of the
which,
nice ones.
Carl,
Yeah.
just to save on time, a follow-up question to that question would be this one precisely. This is from, by the way, Mitch was the one who asked that question earlier. I think this one is from Patrick. So, okay, 350,000 pesos, that's the budget. Where do you start?
At 350, okay, I look at the range above 350, so between 250 to 500,000. Within 250 500,000, you're looking at some very nice Tudors. A lot of the Tudors, the new ones, I think are great. Okay, and the Philippines is an odd market for Tudor because it doesn't appreciate it as much as it should. But collector-wise, it's called the collector handshake. It's the unknown collector handshake because there are these great watches. The silver one is awesome. The gold one is awesome. So and those start in the 250 level. Then once you're past that, you're looking at some of the nice new Breitlings. So yeah, within there you could find anything from Tag Heuers to Oruses. You could find a lot of Mont Blancs. There.
That's a great price point to start with, right? It's a lot
It
of
is.
a
It
lot
is.
of room to play around.
Yeah, but
350,000.
also the argument there is the minute you're at 350, yeah, you can hit 500. It's not that far. So
Well, that's what happens when you get hooked on watches. Okay, what brands excite you most locally? Yeah, because you mentioned a bunch of Philippine brands that are coming up right now. These little micro brands. I see some of these on Instagram. Which ones are? Let's not talk about the ones that you're not so, not excited about. Just the ones that excite you.
okay, okay. There's several, and they take different. Uh, they take different directions. The one that I like the most is one called Clo and Co, which is a bunch of young guys who just got into it and they're treating it seriously, and they're just kind of doing their own thing. They're not trying to make it look like something else. They're not trying to make it look too Filipino, or they're not trading on its Filipino-ness. They're trading on it as a serious watch. It comes in at a good price point. It's very nice. I have some of their stuff. That's my best example right now. But understand that once you start making your own watch, you're torn between your passion side and your we need to make money side. And if you're selling these if you're trying to get someone to take you on as a watch brand in their shop, they're just going to pigeonhole you, okay, into but you're kind of like this, so may as well make it like that. I may as well go with a bigger name than you. That's why things like the Kickstarter, internet, Instagram, and so on. That's why these are all opening up markets for these people. There are what am I excited about now? Corona Tokyo. I'm excited about Corona Tokyo. I'm excited about the Louis Erard collaborations. All these watches they have something that's really, really good, like the finishing of Corona Tokyo, which is Hajime Asaoka's second brand, by the way. But they use standard Japanese movement because they want to make it affordable, but the finishing is gorgeous and the shaping is wonderful. That's what's exciting me, all these new watchmakers.
All right. Well, Patrick, that answers your question. Carl talked about his favorite or what's exciting him locally and what's exciting him internationally. Speaking of which, these micro brands, these independent startups, it's risky, of course. You don't know if they'll be around 5 years from now. How can you tell? I mean, you've covered the watch world for so many years. You've developed this gut feel for brands that survive, brands that don't, that fold up. How can you tell if this small brand will survive?
Okay, that's a really good question. You can't, basically. Some of them, I would put it this way: the smaller they are, without like visions of grandeur or delusions of grandeur, they might do well because they're willing to just kind of run with it. There are some watch brands that are sold in the Philippines that are good. I mean, Swiss watch brands, but the owner, the company the family that owns it, they actually have to have their day jobs because they can't afford to just be watchmakers. So they have to hire professional watchmakers, and they're working in Hong Kong doing something, and they're Swiss. And some of you might know them, and they can't. So the positive thing, and this is where if you get something, let's say from a watch that's it's beautiful on the outside or whatever, but the inside is a mechanism that's sourced from Seiko or Citizen or Unitas. That means that anybody can fix it. So at the very least, you're going to have a watch that can still run. Okay, and there's a lot of movement now away from these big brand watches into these smaller ones, and they're actually very, very hard to get. Some of these things will sell out. The Corona Talk just sell out in 3 minutes. You know, they run pieces. They run 30 to 100 pieces a run. They sell out within minutes. The new Ming watch just sold out in like half an hour.
Okay, Carl, question from Mary Joseph, or is it Joseph Mary, or maybe two different people with the same question? Nevertheless, here's a question: when buying from a reseller, what kind of background check should I do? How can I protect myself? What about when I want to sell? Where should I go? Yeah, that's a common question.
Yeah.
A, should you even buy from a reseller? And B, if you were to buy from a reseller, what to watch out for?
Okay. Even the word reseller is a bit confusing to people because this is all the secondary market, right? But the secondary market is actually viable. I mean, the secondary market can be the jewelry shop that buys from someone else and brings them in because there's no brand representation. It can be the secondary market is people like Bucherer in Switzerland who have their own watch but also sell used watches. It'll come down to, do you trust that seller? And unfortunately now, watches are such a hot item that you can really, really get tricked by people. I guess now, okay, the positive thing is nowadays you're doing face-to-face transactions, right? So quite often nowadays what would happen is if I'm buying a watch from you, David, you and I are going to meet in a bank. I'm going to look it over there. We're going to do the transfer right there. That does not address you going into the watch itself and seeing if it's actually legit, okay? Because you cannot tell a watch, if it's a bad copy or if there's something wrong with it badly, you can tell. But if it's a good copy, or if it might be that the outside is fine and the inside is terrible, or the outside, or if it's a vintage watch, it might be represented as, oh, this is all authentic Rolex, whatever, but it might be all authentic Rolex, but not period correct Rolex. It really comes down to how much you know about that market. And this is where there's a lot of issues, because if you bring your watch, for example, to Rolex, they will produce the best watch they can for you, and they will fix it to the level they think it should be fixed. That does not necessarily answer the needs of a modern collector who wants everything vintage kept as vintage and not touched. Okay, so it might well be that I sell you a watch that I've had serviced only by Rolex for the last 40 years, and it might have modern parts in it, and you as a collector might not want that. Okay, so but it's just it's really hard, honestly. They're trying to answer that with things like you've got blockchain technology now at this point, but even that, it comes down to just trusting the seller. I would tend to buy from groups that after a while, and you trust each other. But even with that, it's not necessarily
okay.
You know.
So like everything else, it's about the seller's reputation and
Yes.
trusting these people, doing your background check. And because you quickly mentioned it, yeah, same thing. What about a vintage watch? A lot of people into that right now. That even becomes trickier because usually these don't come with documents. So how to walk through the whole process of buying a vintage watch?
Okay, once you're buying a vintage watch, you're never going to get a perfect watch. Okay, you're really, really not. There are some people who will have the GMT he bought 40 years ago, and that'll be fine. But at this point, these have become such a hot commodity over the last 10 years that you're kind of looking to buy something because visually it looks nice for most people. That's kind of all I would do, because for me to buy a vintage watch from someone, I'd want to open it up. I'd want to look at it. I'd want to have someone check it. And sometimes that's just not possible nowadays. There are ways to do this online nowadays because you have there actually is like an escrow service where it comes to you, you check it. If there's any problem, they won't release the money and so on, which is essentially the same thing like Lazada does or Shopee, right? So there are ways to do that. But it's just it's a learning process. So understand that once you're going into vintage watches, you really got to learn more. And just look at it as something that's pretty before you start thinking about anything else.
All right. Okay, we have time for one last question. Just to be transparent and clear to everyone, we have a team behind the scenes that's going through the questions you've been sending. So just in case I wasn't able to ask some of your questions, those may not have reached me, or there's not enough time to accommodate that question. So please don't get angry at Carl or myself or anyone else.
Please don't. We will answer your questions. Just call us.
A second session, right? We can have another series. But thank you so much for your questions. And just quickly, because a lot of questions are skewed in this direction, so let me just like kind of summarize it, Carl. You know, people are talking about popular watches, popular models. At the end of the day, how do you avoid riding on a trend? Because we all want to buy a watch that will still cherish generations from now.
Okay, then buy a basic watch. Buy something that's classic or something that speaks to you about a particular time. Okay. If you look at the slide we had of the Rolex Datejust, that's a perpetual classic. It's been around forever, and it will still look gorgeous on your wrist. If you do the trendy stuff like oversized watches nowadays or so on, you know that they will come and go. There are some watches like Panerais, which have always been large, and they're fine. That's the way they are. But there are some watches that are made just because they're larger, and those don't work. So watches can be trendy, and that's fine. But don't push yourself to get something just because it's cool at the moment. Have it speak to you, and it might speak to you because you read about it. I've bought watches I've never seen. It might speak to you because every time you walk by it, it calls you. There's a Grand Seiko I always want, I never buy, but I just love it. So just do that, but make it a process. It's not about the purchase. It's not about the end result. It's about the journey. Okay, and the journey is the most important thing.
Definitely.
And learn about it. Basically.
That's a great way to close, Carl. Thank you so much for your questions, by the way. And thank you so much for your enthusiasm. You can't imagine just how enthusiastic our audience has been. Carl, thanks as well for sharing your time and knowledge with our guests. If you want to reach out directly to Carl, you can do that. Just contact him here. Some of you may have more questions. Just go ahead. The website of Caliber and Instagram account of Caliber is there as well.
And actually, so many questions. Oh my gosh, we missed so many.
And if after this you're suddenly feeling the itch to shop for a new watch, please go ahead. Ayala Malls invites you to check out any one of the watch boutiques in their malls around the country. Any parting tips before I let you go?
Yeah, if you have any questions, contact us. We always love talking about this stuff. It's not about the purchase price. It's not about what other people think. It's about what you think. And you cheat yourself if you don't make the most out of it and learn the most out of it.
Oh, thank you so much. Once again, on behalf of everyone watching this, thank you so much, Carl Cunanan, for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much,
this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, we spoke about how not all timepieces are the same, right? Carl was talking about that, or equally special. In that sense, investing in a luxury timepiece is no different from investing in a special piece of property, and an Ayala Land premier property specifically, a property that endures over time and for future generations to enjoy. In a sense, a perpetual classic. So thank you all for joining us, and feel free to reach out to Ayala Land Premier for any questions about their properties at ayalalandpremier.com and inquire at Ayala Land Premier. And please don't forget to fill up the feedback form available at the webinar chat that you'll find in the tab below. Okay? So I'm David Saldran, and see you on our next Bespoke Lifestyle session. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.